More than 100% casualties. That was the price. The daily reality for units operating the Panzer IV, from Poland to the ruins of Berlin. How did tank divisions lose more men than they had in their original roster? The answer is brutal. The tank lived longer than those who drove it. It became a steel tomb. 5 men went in. Fresh recruits arrived at the front. Young boys climbed through the narrow hatches. They stared at the charred seats inside the cramped hole. They smelled it instantly. The heavy stench of scorched metal and burnt flesh ate deep into the inner lining of the turret. They understood the fate of the men before them. The machines survived. The humans burned. A casualty rate exceeding 100% dictated a ruthless logic. The armor outlasted its original crew entirely. It demanded fresh blood. Command shoved a constant influx of reservists into the breach. Behind the lines, postal workers sorted the paperwork.
They mailed thousands of Black Death notices home. Thin envelopes reached the families of men fighting inside this supposedly unremarkable machine. The Panzer IV was not a forgotten weapon. It was a rolling mass grave. They burned alive in their seats. The armor veterans who crushed Poland drove into an unforeseen nightmare in the summer of 1941. 3 million soldiers and 3,000 tanks launched Operation Barbarossa with total certainty of their supremacy. Then a deafening clang of ricocheting steel shattered the silence. A German gunner slams his firing pedal. Sparks erupt. His shell bounces harmlessly off the sloped hull of a Soviet T-34. He frantically loads another round. He fires. Another ricochet. Cold panic chokes the crew. Through the smoke, the massive enemy turret slowly rotates toward their fragile machine. Panic infected the entire front line. The heavy Soviet KV-1 weighed 47 tons and wielded a lethal 76mm cannon. The standard German Panzer III weighed a mere 22 tons. Its 37 and 50mm guns could not pierce the Soviet steel. German tankmen bitterly nicknamed their useless weapons the Army door knockers. A head-on collision meant guaranteed suicide. The invaders broke formation and fled. Desperate commanders grabbed their radios and ordered 88mm anti-aircraft crews to lower their barrels and open fire. That frantic desperation struck the veterans as an alien feeling. The blind faith in their own invulnerability, the fatal arrogance that guaranteed the Eastern catastrophe, took root exactly 2 years earlier. September 1939. The harsh crackle of static filled the radio headsets. German commanders coordinated the slaughter blindly through the dust and smoke. Every single machine carried a receiver. Voices sliced through the chaos. It turned scattered vehicles into a synchronized fist. Crews expected thick armor to save their lives in a firefight. Reality dictated otherwise. Invisible radio waves secured the conquest of Europe, successfully masking the lethal vulnerability of 15mm hulls. Poland collapsed. France followed. The enemy drove blind. Whenever German tankmen collided with the much heavier French B-1s and Samoa S-35s, they survived by outmaneuvering the clumsy steel giants. Speed beat armor. The high command watched these easy triumphs and embraced the illusion. Generals happily ignored the glaring weakness of their advancing forces. They ordered thousands of men deeper into the meat grinder with paper-thin shields. Early production models carried exactly 15 to 25 millimeters of armor. Paper-thin steel was only half the tragedy. Engineers signed the real death warrant for future crews in quiet offices back in the early 1930s. Germany secretly forged a new army, hiding behind the blinders of the Treaty of Versailles. They drafted blueprints. A single red stamp hit the 1937 documents. It arrogantly classified the massive tank as a mere infantry support transport. Why did designers consciously send men into battle with useless weapons? Headquarters simply did not believe that a support machine would ever meet worthy armor. Generals in cozy chairs rigidly divided the battlefield. They rejected the concept of a universal fighter. The Panzer III became their designated tank killer, carrying 37 and later 50 millimeters of firepower. It hunted machines. The Panzer IV drew the short straw. Commanders accepted it into service in 1937. Bureaucracy shackled these crews to the foot soldiers. Arrogance birthed a death trap. Models from A through F1 rolled onto the front lines, carrying the short 75mm KWK-37 gun. It lobbed explosives at trenches, but against enemy steel, the weapon failed. The barrel generated a muzzle velocity of barely 385 meters per second. This short cannon suffered from a pathetic initial projectile speed. Its armor penetration fell behind even some heavy machine guns. Crews watched their shells bounce off enemy hulls like pebbles. They faced heavy armor inside a doomed metal box. Their only answer to enemy steel measured exactly 75 millimeters. The geometry of their primary tank became a death trap. The elite Panzer III had hit a physical wall. Its turrets were simply too small to carry a heavier weapon. When the pride of the armored forces failed, salvation fell on the despised underdog. The bulky infantry support vehicle had to step up and save a bleeding army. The root of the disaster was purely mechanical. The narrow turret ring of the Panzer III acted as a technological snare. It was a steel collar that doomed an entire generation of German machines. Engineers desperately tried to force a longer 50mm L-60 gun into the cramped space. It changed nothing. The core of the military was obsolete. Survival demanded a drastic, ugly mutation. In the freezing mud of field workshops, mechanics feverishly dismantled the old, stubby barrels. Blinding flashes of welding torches reflected on the dirt-stained faces of exhausted engineers. They ripped out the useless guns to mount a massive, long weapon directly into the wider turret of the Panzer IV. By early 1942, this brutal frontline surgery birthed the Model F2. It carried the lethal 75mm KWK-40L-43 gun. The infantry escort was gone. A tank killer took its place. The new weapon shattered sloped enemy steel at a distance of over 1,000 meters. Soon after, the Model G arrived with the even longer L-48 gun. This raw upgrade increased muzzle velocity so sharply that the kinetic energy of the shell nearly doubled. A desperate technical mutation turned the eternal prey into a lethal predator. Crews painted over the fresh weld marks and loaded the massive rounds. Trained dispatchers immediately routed the heavy, mutated machines straight toward the active front lines. These freshly mutated machines rolled off the supply trains straight into a psychological meat grinder. Soviet manufacturing was already crushing human minds at a relentless rate of 1,000 tanks per month. How long could an elite crew maintain sanity when 5 new targets instantly replaced one burned machine? Nerves shattered before the ammunition. Inside the notoriously cramped 2-man turret of an advancing T-34, a lone Soviet commander frantically kicked smoking brass away. He wrestled heavy 76mm rounds into the breach while desperately screaming directional orders over the roaring diesel engine. This internal layout was a suffocating trap that quickly turned every engagement into a bloody, uncoordinated chaos. But this disorganized steel avalanche possessed a terrifying momentum that simply buried German precision under sheer factory volume. A deafening, high-explosive detonation from an encroaching Su-152 violently ruptured the eardrums of the exhausted defenders. These massive, self-propelled platforms shattered heavy frontal armor plates with overwhelming kinetic force. Panic consumed the German trenches. By mid-1943, Eastern tank factories were delivering more than 30 new combat vehicles every single day. Tactical victories meant nothing. The relentless arrival of fresh reserves instantly erased every hard-fought localized triumph across the burning steppes. Soviet commanders easily absorbed a devastating 5-to-1 combat loss ratio while continually pushing their massive westward offensive. Berlin demanded a miracle. Command hurled heavy armor against the Soviet tide. Salvation became a steel trap. Suffocating black smoke billowed from burning transmissions of brand new Panthers right on the march. Steel shattered. Crews burned. Untested. Doomed. Soldiers prayed for these tanks.
The heavy Tiger brought a massive 88mm gun. It killed from afar. But Tigers were hopelessly rare. The Panther promised total superiority. Its long 75mm gun pierced anything. Haste ruined the dream. New machines died before firing a single shot. Men watched their salvation turn to ash. Despair infected the ranks. Even the reliable Stug 3 assault gun could not hold the line alone. It lacked a turret. It fought strictly from ambush. While the propaganda ministry promised crushing victories, giant tank destroyers like the Elephant merely deepened a catastrophic logistical nightmare. Superweapons failed. The front choked on broken metal. Commanders officially forced the exhausted men back into older, proven machines. While the boasted Panthers broke down on the march, the entire burden of the war shifted. It crushed the crews of the old Panzer IVs. These men trained as artillerymen. Now commanders forced them to spearhead frontal tank assaults. Why turn a maneuverable support vehicle into a clumsy, overloaded monster? Command simply had no choice left after the mass failures of new armor. The front line demanded a breakthrough tank. The modification H arrived at the front. It triggered a mechanical agony. Exhausted mechanics crawled through the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. Their hands bled. They struggled to bolt heavy steel plates onto the sides of aging machines. They mounted the massive long-barreled L-48 gun. Installing this artillery and extra armor critically overloaded a chassis that engineers originally designed for a light infantry support vehicle. The suspension groaned. Physics took its toll. Breakdowns became inevitable. Soviet tank factories operated at maximum speed. The steppes swarmed with infantry. The enemy carried the PTRD-41 anti-tank rifle. Its rounds easily punched through the original German steel. Then came the sharp metallic screech of a bullet ricocheting off the new protective screens. The crew survived, but the tank died from within. Transmissions shattered under the massive weight. Engines burned out trying to push the beast forward. The men fought inside a metal coffin that slowly tore itself apart. Crews welded the 18mm thick side skirts. Mechanics slapped these shirts onto the hull in a frenzy of sheer desperation. The Panzer IV officially held the status of the only reliable tank during the spring of 1943. The exhausted Panzer IV crews were blind. They knew nothing. Hitler prepared the bloodiest meat grinder in history. It waited at a small bulge near Kursk. Why pull hundreds of divisions to a single map point? The leader made a fatal bet, a breakthrough at any cost. Operation Citadel began. Multi-layered minefields already covered Kursk. They waited silently for the German tracks. More than 6,000 tanks rolled east. Thousands of aircraft started their engines. 2 million soldiers marched. 2 million men. The exact population of a major European metropolis. Berlin brought them to die in one bare field. Total annihilation. No turning back. Commanders issued the final orders and threw 2 million people directly into the epicenter of the battle. By the 12th of July, the Kursk meat grinder had achieved the impossible. Crew mortality rates soared past 100% of the original roster. How could combat losses exceed 100%? The answer was pure mechanical slaughter. Mechanics patched up crippled tanks and threw them right back into the fire with fresh men. In a standard infantry unit, such catastrophic casualties meant immediate disbandment. Here, commanders simply swapped the ruined, living tissue inside the unbroken steel shells. Flesh became a spare part. The massacre peaked at Prokhorovka. Thousands of tons of armor collided at point-blank range. Endless swarms of T-34s rammed directly into the German formations. Armor pierced armor. Vehicles burned. Men fought on foot among the smoking wreckage. Soviet commanders gladly traded 5 machines for a single German kill. The Reich lacked that luxury. The mighty war machines survived the kinetic impacts. Their human operators did not. A standard medium tank held a crew of 5. Once a shell breached the hull, 5 lives evaporated in a flash of pressurized fire. Then the conveyor of death restarted. Medics dragged charred bodies out of the open hatches. Mechanics stepped in immediately. They slapped crude steel welds over the gaping penetration holes. Inside the hastily repaired turrets, the suffocating stench of burnt rubber and baked blood still lingered. Nobody washed the interiors. There was no time. Terrified teenagers climbed straight into the stained seats. An anonymous tanker from the 11th Panzer Division captured this nightmare in his diary. He wrote that the replacement crews did not even know each other's names. 5 strangers trapped in a metal box. They drove forward. They just waited for their turn. The replacements for the incinerated veterans of the 11th Division brought no salvation. They had no hundreds of hours of tactical drills behind them. Cold tremors shook the hands of teenagers. They gripped the heavy steering levers for the very first time. Command shoved them into semi-operational steel boxes. No combat experience, no basic communication. Most machines lacked working radios. Outside their old armor, the enemy had evolved. The Soviet T-34-85 hunted them with a lethal 85mm gun, piercing outdated German hulls from a massive distance. The heavy IS-2 fired a brutal 122mm cannon. That machine never needed a second shot. Meanwhile, American forces pushed relentlessly from the west. The M4 Sherman rolled forward in endless waves. By 1944, the technological gap became an abyss. Command threw untrained schoolboys against vastly superior Allied armor, merely to delay the inevitable frontline collapse. They drove straight into the slaughter. But the Reich could no longer support even this desperate sacrifice. Mechanics dispatched the final combat columns with empty fuel tanks and 0 reserve shells. The roots of that 1944 hopelessness trace back to a single summer morning. July 5, 1943. The Eastern Front. Here, the illusion of German superiority burned to ash. The brand new Panther tanks did not even reach the battlefield. Engines caught fire. Transmissions shattered. Factory defects turned heavy armor into dead weight before the combat began. Was there a chance for a breakthrough? No. Soviet intelligence and partisan networks knew every step in advance. Red Army engineers spent months preparing a colossal trap. Over 1 million landmines waited under the dirt. Defense lines stretched for 300 kilometers into the rear. Thousands of camouflaged explosive charges waited for every single attacking German tank. The order came. Advance. Older machines pushed forward, backed by heavy Tiger tanks. Steel tracks crawled over the open ground. Then came the blast. A blinding flash erupted under the belly. The vehicle stopped dead. Muffled clanks of breaking metal echoed across the dust. Immediately, the whistle of zeroed-in artillery shrieked overhead. Soviet anti-tank crews unleashed focused fire on the immobilized targets. Shells pierced armor, hatches blew open. Crews burned alive inside their steel coffins. Every meter of soil existed solely for their destruction. The command still demanded forward momentum. Men drove straight into the meticulously calculated meat grinder. The offensive choked on its own blood. Night fell. Evacuation teams dragged the charred hulls back through the mud under the cover of darkness. The salvaged wrecks from those minefields changed nothing. By the second week of July, the German offensive choked on its own ambitions. Operation Citadel collapsed. The grand push died in the dirt. The Third Reich's war engine finally broke down. The Red Army surged forward. They unleashed new divisions, fresh armor, and relentless counterattacks. A long, agonizing retreat began. Every new dawn merely stretched the casualty lists. Losing veteran tank commanders in a few short weeks gutted the military. The Army lost its most vital resource. Factories could forge new steel plates and weld new turrets. Assembly lines could not manufacture human experience. By 1944, the supply chain completely evaporated. Crews lacked the most irreplaceable basics. Mechanics frantically scavenged broken tracks. Empty jerry cans held absolutely no fuel. Without spare parts, the crippled panzers turned into static steel traps. Inside those claustrophobic cabins, death became a cold statistical certainty.
A young gunner's lifespan lasted only until the exact moment the next Soviet armor-piercing round shattered the hull. They fought, they burned, the retreat ground their divisions into ash. The summer offensive left behind thousands of dead and missing tankers. The 1960s unleashed a new war. Artillery shells tore through the Golan Heights. Even after the Nazi regime burned to the ground, its steel coffins refused to rest. Where did these machines fire their last shots? In the Syrian sands, 2 full decades later. Syria bought the surviving scrap. Mechanics painted over the faded iron crosses, dragging the ruined machines into another foreign bloodbath. The scorching wind blasted the cracked armor. It buried the rusting turrets under heavy layers of blinding yellow dust. These were no longer the proud spearheads of a global offensive. They were forgotten relics. Stolen graves swallowed a brand new generation of crews. The ghosts of Europe found one last fight. Across the rocky ridges, German optics tracked familiar silhouettes. Their sights settled on Israeli Shermans. Captured trophies hunted their old enemies once again. A dead conflict echoed across an alien wasteland. But the steel broke. The sand took them.